I was holy once. Let me tell you what that means, truly means. To have walked in the Emperor's light as one of his chosen daughters, to have worn the sacred armor of the Adepta Sororitas and carried his fury into battle against the enemies of mankind, to have known with absolute certainty that every breath I drew was blessed, and every life I took was sanctified, and every moment of my existence served a purpose so profound that death itself held no terror for me. I was Sister Celestine Draven of the Order of the Bloody Rose, a warrior of faith whose devotion had been tested in the fires of 17 campaigns across 9 worlds, whose blade had ended the lives of heretics and Xenos beyond counting, whose prayers had risen like incense to the golden throne and been answered with the strength to continue fighting when flesh and bone should have failed. I was holy. I was his instrument. I was everything a sister of battle should be. And then I failed. The failure was not dramatic. It was not the grand betrayal that the chronicles record when they speak of sisters who fell to corruption or doubt, or the insidious whispers of powers that hunger for the souls of the faithful. My failure was small, human, the kind of weakness that the sisterhood cannot permit precisely because it is so common, so understandable, so easy to forgive in anyone except those who have sworn to be more than human in their devotion to the Emperor's service. I hesitated 3 years ago on a world called Carthus Majoris, during the suppression of a cult that had taken root in the underhive populations. I hesitated. We had breached the inner sanctum of the heretics' gathering place, had fought through corridors slick with blood and thick with the smoke of sanctified promethium, had reached the chamber where the cult's leader conducted the rituals that had damned 10,000 souls to whatever fate awaits those who turn from the Emperor's light. The leader stood before us, surrounded by the children she had corrupted, boys and girls no older than 7 or 8. Their eyes glazed with the influence of whatever powers she had invoked, their hands holding weapons they barely knew how to use, their small bodies positioned between her and the sisters who had come to deliver the Emperor's judgment. My superior ordered the advance. My superior ordered us to cut through the children to reach the heretic behind them. I hesitated. It was only a moment. A single heartbeat in which my blade did not move. My feet did not carry me forward. My faith did not override the human weakness that saw children rather than heretics, innocents rather than tools of corruption, lives worth saving rather than obstacles to be removed. My sisters did not hesitate. They advanced as ordered, their blades singing hymns of purification as they carved through the small bodies that stood between them and their objective. The cult leader died screaming prayers to gods that could not save her. The mission was completed. The heresy was purged. But I had hesitated, and hesitation in the sisterhood is sin. I do not know who reported me. Perhaps one of my sisters, observing my failure in the chaos of battle. Perhaps the superior herself, whose eyes missed nothing and whose standards permitted no weakness among those who served under her command. Perhaps I confessed it myself in the prayers that followed the engagement, unable to carry the weight of my failure without acknowledging it to someone who might help me understand what it meant. The source does not matter. The consequence does. I was brought before the Canaaness of our commandery, a woman I had served under for 11 years, whose approval I had sought with every action of my career, whose disappointment I feared more than any enemy I had ever faced on the battlefield. She listened as the charges were read. Hesitation in the face of the enemy, failure to execute lawful orders, weakness of faith demonstrated through the prioritization of human sentiment over sacred duty. She asked me if the charges were accurate. I told her the truth, because lying to a canoness is a sin far greater than the one I had already committed. And because some fragment of me still believed that honesty might earn mercy, even though I knew the sisterhood's doctrines left little room for such considerations. She did not speak for a long time after I finished. She simply looked at me, her eyes holding an expression I could not read, her face betraying nothing of the judgment that was forming behind it. "You were one of our finest," she said finally, and her voice was heavy with something that might have been grief, might have been anger, might have been the particular weariness of a woman who had passed such judgments many times before and found no comfort in the repetition. 17 campaigns, commendations beyond counting, a record of service that would have seen you elevated to superior within the decade, perhaps canoness yourself in time. She paused, and I saw her hand move to touch the rosarius that hung at her throat, the sacred symbol of her office and her faith. And you hesitated. You saw corrupted children being used as shields by a heretic, and instead of trusting in the emperor's wisdom, instead of believing that his plan encompasses all things, including the deaths of those too young to understand the damnation they served, you allowed human weakness to stay your blade. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to explain that the children had not chosen their corruption, that they had been victims rather than perpetrators, that surely the emperor's mercy extended to those who had been used rather than those who had chosen to fall. But I did not speak because I knew that such arguments were themselves heresy, were the same rationalizations that led sisters down paths far darker than the one I had walked, were the beginning of a descent that ended only in apostasy and damnation. I remained silent. I accepted the judgment that I knew was coming. "You will be stripped of your armor," the canoness said. "You will be struck from the rolls of the Order of the Bloody Rose. You will surrender your name, your rank, your place among the sisterhood you have shamed through your weakness." She leaned forward, and her eyes held mine with an intensity that burned. "You will become Repentia. You will seek redemption through death in the Emperor's service, fighting without the protection your sin has proven you unworthy to bear, dying as penance for the failure that has stained your soul. This is the mercy the sisterhood offers to those who fail. Not execution, not exile, but the opportunity to wash away sin with blood, to earn through sacrifice what you could not maintain through faith." She made the sign of the Aquila, and I understood that my life as Sister Celestine Draven was over. I had 3 days to prepare, 3 days to remove the armor I had worn for 19 years, to surrender the weapons that had become extensions of my body, to pray in the chapel where I had offered devotions since the day I was inducted into the order as a novice of 14 years. I spent those days in silence, speaking to no one, eating nothing, drinking only the consecrated water that sustained my body, while my soul grappled with the transformation it was about to undergo. The ceremony of casting down is not spoken of outside the sisterhood. I will not describe it in detail, because some things are sacred even in their horror, even when they mark the destruction of everything a woman has been. I will say only that it was thorough, that it was witnessed, that every symbol of my former status was removed with prayers that transformed removal into ritual and ritual into judgment. When it was complete, I stood naked before my former sisters, bearing nothing except the sins that had brought me to this moment, and the small hope that death might eventually cleanse them. They gave me the shift, a simple garment of white cloth that covered my body, but offered no protection, no warmth, no dignity beyond the minimum required to preserve modesty. They gave me the neural whips, the devices that would bind me to the mistress of repentance who would lead me into battle, that would ensure my compliance even if my courage failed, that would drive me forward when my flesh screamed for retreat. They gave me the eviscerator, the massive chainsword that Repentia carry into combat, a weapon too large for normal humans to wield effectively, a tool of destruction that requires both hands and absolute commitment to bring against the enemy. And they gave me a new name, a designation that replaced the identity I had surrendered. I was no longer Sister Celestine Draven. I was Repentia Seven to Carthis, the seventh sister cast down in the aftermath of the Carthis Majoris campaign, one of many who had found their faith wanting in the fires of that particular purge. I was Repentia. I was sin given flesh, weakness given form, failure walking upright and seeking the death that would finally make me clean. Let me tell you what came next. Let me tell you what it means to live as Repentia, to fight without armor in battles that armored warriors struggle to survive, to seek death that refuses to come, no matter how fervently you throw yourself against the Emperor's enemies. Let me tell you what it costs to be turned from a holy warrior into a penitent monster, and why, after 3 years of seeking the redemption that death would bring, I am still alive to speak these words. The first thing you learn as Repentia is that you are no longer human, not in the biological sense. The body remains scarred and suffering, but fundamentally unchanged from the flesh that once wore power armor and carried the sisterhood's sacred weapons into battle. But in every other sense that matters to those who must continue existing in a universe that no longer has a place for them, humanity is stripped away along with the armor and the name and the rank. You are not a person. You are not a warrior. You are not even truly a penitent, though that is the word they use to describe what you have become. You are a weapon, nothing more, nothing less. A weapon forged from failure, tempered by shame, pointed at the Emperor's enemies, with the understanding that your only remaining value lies in the damage you can inflict before you finally break. The Mistress of Repentance ensures that you never forget this truth. Sister Superior Morvenna was assigned to oversee the penitent squad to which I was attached. 12 women who had failed in various ways, whose sins ranged from my hesitation to crimes I never learned the details of, but could sometimes guess from the haunted look in eyes that refused to meet mine. She was not cruel, Morvenna. Cruelty would have implied that she took pleasure in our suffering, that she inflicted pain for reasons beyond the requirements of her sacred duty. She was simply thorough, rigorous, absolute in her commitment to the purpose that the sisterhood had assigned to her. The deployment of Repentia in situations where our deaths would serve the Emperor's purposes and our survival would be an inconvenience to be corrected at the next opportunity. The neural whips bound us to her will. I did not understand, before I wore them, how complete that binding could be. The devices are implanted at the base of the skull, threaded through the nervous system in ways that the tech priests understand, but do not explain to those who receive them. When the mistress activates the connection, you feel her, not her thoughts, not her emotions, but her commands, transmitted directly into the parts of your brain that control movement and impulse, and the fundamental decisions about whether to advance or retreat, fight or flee. You can resist, theoretically. The neural whips do not override free will entirely, but resistance brings pain, not the clean pain of a wound, not the honest agony of flesh torn by enemy weapons, but something deeper, something that feels like your soul itself is being flayed by implements designed for precisely that purpose. I resisted once, in those early days. I learned not to resist again. The battles came quickly after my casting down. The sisterhood does not waste resources, and Repentia are resources, expendable, replaceable, valuable only insofar as they can be deployed against enemies that would cost more precious lives to defeat. We were attached to a strike force operating in the Carthax subsector, hunting down remnants of a chaos cult that had scattered after their primary stronghold was purged. The cultists had fled into the wilderness regions of a dozen worlds, establishing footholds in places too remote for conventional forces to reach efficiently, too dangerous for standard infantry to assault without unacceptable casualties. Repentia do not generate unacceptable casualties. Repentia are themselves the acceptable casualties, the lives that commanders can spend without concern, the bodies that can be thrown against fortified positions with the understanding that their deaths serve the Emperor, regardless of whether their attacks succeed. My first engagement as Repentia came 19 days after my casting down. We descended upon a cultist encampment in the mountains of a world whose name I was not permitted to know, such knowledge being reserved for those whose identities entitled them to remember the places where they fought and died. There were perhaps 200 cultists in the camp, dug into positions that overlooked the only viable approach, armed with weapons that would have shredded any force attempting a conventional assault. The tactical assessment was clear. The camp could be taken, but the cost would be significant, potentially dozens of sisters whose lives held value that the mission did not justify spending. The Repentia went first. We always go first. I remember the charge with a clarity that has not faded across 3 years of subsequent battles, subsequent charges, subsequent moments of throwing myself against enemies in the hope that this time, finally, death would claim me and my penance would be complete. The mountain air was cold against my bare arms, my bare legs, the exposed flesh that my shift did nothing to protect. My eviscerator roared in my hands, its chain teeth hungry for the blood I had been sent to spill. Around me, my fellow Repentia screamed prayers that were also battle cries, invocations of the Emperor that were also declarations of our intent to die in his service. The cultists opened fire. I saw Repentia 3 to Carthis fall, her body torn apart by heavy stubber rounds before she had covered half the distance to the enemy lines. Repentia 9. Carthis followed moments later, a lass bolt taking her through the throat, her prayer ending in a gurgle of blood that sprayed across my face as I passed her, falling form. Repentia 2. Carthis made it further, almost reaching the barricades before a cultist with a chainsword met her charge and carved her open from shoulder to hip. I reached the enemy. I do not know how. I do not know why their weapons missed me, why their blades failed to find my flesh, why the death I sought with every fiber of my being refused to answer my desperate invitation. I reached them, and my eviscerator did the work it had been designed to do, and I killed with an abandon that I had never permitted myself when I wore armor, and bore the responsibilities of a sister whose life held value, killed without thought or hesitation, or any of the human weakness that had brought me to this place of penance and blood. When the engagement ended, I was standing in the ruins of the cultist position, surrounded by the bodies of those I had slain, soaked in blood that was not my own. 8 of my fellow Repentia had died in the charge. 4 of us remained, wounded in ways that would scar but not kill, alive when we should have been dead, breathing when we had thrown ourselves against death with everything we had. Mistress Morvenna surveyed our survival with an expression I could not read. "The Emperor has not yet accepted your penance," she said, and her voice held neither approval nor disappointment, only the flat statement of fact that defined our existence. "You will have other opportunities to offer it." We had other opportunities, many other opportunities. The pattern repeated across months that became years, campaigns that blurred together into a continuous liturgy of violence and survival. We were deployed against enemies that ranged from cultists to Xenos, to rebels who had rejected imperial authority. any foe that required the application of force without concern for the lives of those applying it. We charged into fire that should have killed us. We fought in close quarters against enemies that outnumbered us 10 to 1, 20 to 1, ratios that would have been suicide for any force that valued its own preservation. We died, not all of us, not every time, but enough that the faces around me changed constantly. New Repentia arriving to replace those who had finally found the death they sought. The redemption that combat offered to those whose sins could only be washed away in blood. I did not die. Battle after battle, charge after charge, I did not die. The wounds accumulated, scars that covered my body in patterns that told the story of every engagement I had survived. Every moment when death had passed close enough to touch, but had not chosen to claim me. I bore cuts and burns and the marks of weapons that had torn my flesh without reaching the organs beneath. I walked with a limp from an injury that had never healed properly, fought with pain that had become so constant I no longer noticed it except in the quiet moments between battles when there was nothing to distract me from the ruin my body had become. But I did not die, and in the Repentia, survival is its own form of torment. The others noticed. The other Repentia, the ones who fought beside me and watched me emerge from engagements that claimed half our number, began to look at me differently. Not with admiration, not with respect, but with something closer to suspicion, as though my continued existence was itself a kind of heresy, a refusal to accept the redemption that the Emperor was offering to everyone except me. Why won't he take you? Repentia fought a Nexus, asked me once, in the barracks where we were permitted to rest between deployments. She was new, her casting down less than a month old. Her body still unmarked by the scars that would accumulate if she survived long enough to earn them. You fight harder than any of us. You take risks that should kill you, but you keep coming back. I had no answer for her. I had asked myself the same question 1,000 times, had prayed for understanding in the darkness of cells where Repentia were housed, like weapons awaiting deployment, had begged the Emperor to explain why he would not accept the death I offered him with such desperate sincerity. Repentia, 4. Nexus died in the next engagement, her prayer finally answered, her penance finally complete. I survived. I always survived. And I began to wonder, in the depths of that survival, whether my continued existence was truly the Emperor's will, or whether it was something else entirely, a curse rather than a blessing, a punishment more terrible than death, because it denied me the only redemption available to those who had failed as thoroughly as I had failed. 2 years into my penance, I stopped seeking death. Not because I no longer wanted it. The desire remained, constant and consuming, the only thing I had left that resembled purpose or meaning. But I stopped seeking it because I had begun to understand that seeking was pointless, that death would not come for me no matter how fervently I invited it, that some other fate awaited me at the end of this road of blood and survival. I did not know what that fate was. I was afraid to find out, but I knew that I would not escape it through the clean exit that death would have provided. I was Repentia. I was sin made flesh. And I was beginning to suspect that my sin was greater than I had understood, that my penance would require more than the death I had been seeking, that the Emperor had plans for me that did not include the simple mercy of ending. The moment I understood came on a world called Verathos Quintus in the 3rd year of my penance. We had been deployed against a cult that had infested one of the planet's primary hive cities. Not chaos worshippers this time, but something arguably worse. A genestealer infestation that had been spreading through the underhive for decades, breeding its corruption through generations of hosts who did not understand what they carried in their blood. The cult had finally revealed itself, rising in coordinated rebellion across the hive's lower levels, and the sisterhood had been called to purge what remained before the contamination could spread further. The fighting was brutal in ways that even my scarred experience had not prepared me for. The cultists fought with a ferocity that transcended human courage, their devotion to their patriarch driving them to acts of sacrifice that matched anything the Repentia ourselves could offer. They did not retreat. They did not surrender. They threw themselves against our lines with the absolute conviction of beings who believed they were fighting for something sacred, something worth dying for, something that gave meaning to their brief and violent existence. I understood them. This was the horror that crept into my consciousness as I carved through their ranks with my eviscerator, as I watched my fellow Repentia fall around me to claws and improvised weapons and the sheer weight of bodies that the cultists hurled against our advance. I understood the light in their eyes, the certainty in their prayers, the willingness to die for a faith that promised them salvation, even though that salvation was a lie constructed by Xenos things that viewed them as nothing more than hosts. They were me. They were what I had been, before my hesitation revealed the weakness beneath my devotion. True believers, dying for truths that might not be true. The advance carried us into the deepest levels of the cult's territory, into chambers where the patriarch waited with its most devoted servants. Mistress Morvenna drove us forward with commands transmitted through the neural whips, her will overriding the exhaustion and the wounds and the simple human desire to stop, to rest, to exist for a single moment as something other than weapons being fired at an enemy. We pushed through corridors that stank of the alien musk that Genestealers exuded, past shrines decorated with symbols that blended the Imperial Aquila with the four-armed iconography of the Xenos infection, toward the heart of a corruption that had been growing for longer than I had been alive. We found them in the final chamber, the Patriarch and its innermost circle, and we found the children, hundreds of them, third and fourth generation hybrids, their features bearing the marks of their ancestry in ways that ranged from subtle to grotesque, their eyes holding the same glazed devotion I had seen on Carthus Majoris 3 years before. They stood between us and the Patriarch, arranged in ranks that seemed designed to evoke exactly the same response that my hesitation had demonstrated. The human weakness that sees children as innocents rather than threats, that cannot bring itself to cut through small bodies, even when those bodies serve the purposes of monsters. I understood in that moment that this was not coincidence. The Emperor had brought me here. The Emperor had arranged this test, this repetition of the failure that had cast me down, this opportunity to prove that my penance had burned away the weakness that had stained my soul. I would face the same choice I had faced before: advance through children to reach the enemy, or hesitate and prove that 3 years of seeking death had taught me nothing. Mistress Morvenna's command came through the neural whips, familiar and absolute. Advance, purge, show no mercy. I advanced. I did not hesitate. Not for a heartbeat, not for a fraction of a second, not for any of the moments of weakness that had destroyed my previous life and condemned me to this existence of blood and penance. I raised my eviscerator and I charged into those ranks of hybrid children, and I killed them with the same efficiency I had developed across 3 years of killing everything the sisterhood placed before me. They died screaming. Some of them called for parents who could not save them. Some of them tried to fight, their small hands clutching weapons they barely knew how to hold. Some of them simply stood frozen, their hybrid minds unable to process the violence descending upon them, their deaths coming before they understood that death was even possible. I killed them all. I carved a path through their ranks with prayers on my lips and blood on my blade, and nothing nothing at all in my heart except the cold determination to complete the mission, to reach the patriarch, to prove that I was no longer the woman who had hesitated on Carthis Majoris. The patriarch died. The cult was purged. The mission was completed. And I stood in that chamber, surrounded by the small bodies of the children I had slaughtered, and I waited for something to change. I waited for the redemption I had earned through this act of absolute obedience. I waited for the Emperor to finally accept the penance I had offered, to take me at last into whatever fate awaited those who had proven their worthiness through the sacrifice of every human instinct that might have stayed their hands. Nothing changed. The neural whips fell silent as Mistress Morvenna surveyed the carnage. My fellow Repentia, those who had survived, stood among the dead, with expressions I could not read through the blood that covered their faces. The chamber held nothing except corpses, and the lingering smell of promethium, and the particular silence that follows violence too extreme for the universe to process, without pausing to absorb its implications. I had not hesitated. I had proven myself. I had done what the sisterhood demanded. And I felt nothing. No redemption, no cleansing, no sense that my sin had been washed away by the blood I had spilled in the Emperor's name. I felt only emptiness, an absence where something should have been. Mistress Morvenna approached me as the other sisters began the process of securing the chamber and confirming that no cultists had escaped our purge. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes holding something I had never seen in them before. Not the flat assessment of a commander evaluating a weapon, but something more personal, more complex, more troubling. "You did not hesitate," she said. "No, mistress. You killed them without pause, without mercy, without any of the weakness that brought you to us." "Yes, mistress." She was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost gentle in a way that I had not believed her capable of. "Tell me, Repentia Seventh Carthis, how do you feel?" I opened my mouth to give the answer she expected. Purified, cleansed, ready to continue serving until the Emperor finally accepted my death. But the words would not come. The lie was too large, too obvious, too contrary to the emptiness that had opened inside me like a wound that would not close. "I feel nothing," I said. "I thought I would feel something. I thought this would be the moment when my penance was accepted, when my sin was finally forgiven. But I feel nothing except absence, as though something that should be there is missing." Mistress Morvenna nodded slowly, and I saw in her expression a recognition that chilled me more than any enemy I had ever faced. "That is the truth of penance," she said. "The truth that we do not speak of, that we do not teach to those who are cast down, that we allow them to discover for themselves in moments like this one." She gestured to the bodies around us, the children I had slaughtered without hesitation. "You hesitated on Carthis Majoris because you saw something human in the corrupted children who stood before you. You saw innocence that deserved protection, lives that held value regardless of the corruption that had claimed them. This was weakness, yes. This was the sin for which you were cast down. But it was also—" She paused, and I saw something flicker across her features that might have been pain. "It was also humanity, the part of you that could still see children as children, that could still feel the weight of ending lives that had not chosen their own damnation, the part that made you more than a weapon, more than a tool, more than a simple instrument of destruction." I stared at her, uncomprehending. This was not what the doctrines taught. This was not what I had been told about the nature of my sin and the penance that would cleanse it. "You have killed that part of yourself. Mistress Morvenna continued. You have burned it away through 3 years of slaughter, through the repetition of violence until violence became automatic, through the systematic destruction of every instinct that might have interfered with the execution of orders. You no longer hesitate because you no longer possess the humanity that made hesitation possible. She reached out and touched my face, a gesture so unexpected that I flinched from it before I could control my response. This is what the Repentia truly are, she said. Not penitents seeking redemption, but weapons being forged. The casting down, the deprivation, the battles without armor. All of it designed to strip away everything that makes a sister human, to leave behind nothing except the capacity for violence without conscience, without hesitation, without any of the human weakness that might interfere with the absolute execution of the sisterhood's will. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to insist that my penance had meaning, that my suffering served a purpose, that the Emperor was watching and would eventually accept the death I had been offering for 3 years. But I looked at the bodies around me, the children I had killed without feeling anything, and I understood that she was speaking truth. I had not found redemption. I had found obliteration. The woman who had hesitated on Carthus Majoris, the sister who had seen children as children and had been unable to murder them without pause. She was gone. I had killed her more thoroughly than I had killed any of the enemies I faced in battle. I had sacrificed her on the altar of penance, believing that her destruction would earn me forgiveness. And instead, I had simply become something less than I had been before. Something useful. Something empty. Something that could kill without conscience, because conscience had been carved out of me by the very process that was supposed to restore my soul. Mistress Morvenna withdrew her hand, and her expression returned to the flat assessment I was accustomed to. You will continue to serve, she said. You will continue to fight. You will continue to kill without hesitation, because that is what you are now, and the sisterhood has uses for what you have become. She turned away, leaving me alone among the bodies. Whether you live or die no longer matters, she said over her shoulder. The penance was never about your death. It was about your transformation. And that transformation is complete. I stood in that chamber for a long time after she left, looking at the children I had murdered, trying to feel something, anything, that might prove her wrong. I felt nothing. I was Repentia. I was weapon. And I understood, finally, that this had always been the point. They offered me restoration 6 months after Verathos Quintus. The summons came through Mistress Morvenna, delivered with the same flat efficiency that characterized all her communications with the weapons under her command. I was to report to the canoness of our expedition force, to stand before the same rank of authority that had cast me down 3.5 years before, to receive judgment on a penance that had apparently reached its conclusion. I did not understand. The doctrines taught that Repentia served until death claimed them, that restoration was granted only to those rare souls who survived impossible odds, and demonstrated through that survival the Emperor's direct intervention on their behalf. I had survived, yes, had survived far longer than any Repentia should survive, but I had not experienced anything that felt like divine intervention. I had simply refused to die, battle after battle, my body accumulating damage while my soul accumulated emptiness. But I reported as commanded. Obedience was the only thing I had left. Canoness Helenia Vrath received me in her chambers, aboard the strike cruiser that served as our expedition's mobile headquarters. She was older than I remembered the canoness of my original order being, her face lined with decades of command, her eyes holding the particular weight that came from making decisions that sent thousands of women to their deaths. She looked at me for a long time before speaking, her gaze moving across the scars that covered every visible inch of my flesh, cataloguing the damage I had sustained across years of fighting without armor. "You are Celestine Draven," she said finally, "Order of the Bloody Rose, cast down for hesitation during the Carthus Majoris campaign." "Yes, Canoness. You have served as Repentia for 3 years, 7 months, and 14 days. You have participated in 43 engagements. You have sustained wounds that would have killed any unaugmented human multiple times over. You have demonstrated absolute obedience to command, absolute commitment to mission objectives, absolute elimination of the weakness that led to your casting down." She paused, and something flickered across her features that I could not identify. "Mistress Morvenna speaks highly of you. She says you have become the most effective weapon in her arsenal. She says you no longer possess the capacity for hesitation, that you have been purified of the humanity that once made you unreliable." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. "The sisterhood has need of such weapons," the canoness continued. "Not as Repentia. The role has served its purpose in your case, but as something else. Something that combines the training and knowledge you possessed before your fall with the refinement you have undergone since." She rose from her chair and approached me, her movements careful, deliberate, as though she were examining a blade she was considering adding to her collection. "I am offering you restoration, Celestine Draven. Not to the Order of the Bloody Rose. Your sins against that order cannot be erased, but to a new role, a new purpose. The Sisterhood maintains units composed of those who have undergone transformations similar to yours. Sisters who have been stripped of weakness through the crucible of penance and emerged as instruments of absolute purpose. You would serve among them, restored to armor and rank, your skills put to use in ways that mere Repentia cannot achieve." I should have felt something. Joy, perhaps, at the prospect of escaping the endless cycle of battles without protection. Relief at the acknowledgement that my suffering had meaning, that it had led somewhere other than the empty death I had been seeking. Pride that the canoness herself had recognized my worth and chosen to elevate me from the ranks of the condemned. I felt nothing. The emptiness that had opened inside me on Varathos Quintus had not closed. If anything, it had grown, spreading through the spaces where emotion had once resided, leaving behind only the cold functionality that Mistress Morvenna had described. "I accept," I said, because acceptance was the only response the situation permitted. The canoness nodded, unsurprised by my answer. "The ceremony of restoration will take place tomorrow. You will be given new armor, new weapons, a new name and identity to mark your rebirth as an instrument of the Emperor's will. The woman you were is dead. The weapon you have become will serve purposes she could never have imagined." She returned to her chair and made a gesture of dismissal. "Go, prepare yourself. Tomorrow you begin again." I went. I prepared. I knelt in the chapel of the strike cruiser and offered prayers to an emperor I no longer knew how to feel, reciting words I had memorized decades ago that now felt like sounds without meaning, shapes without substance, the empty forms of devotion performed by a creature that no longer possessed the capacity for genuine faith. The attack came that night. We had been tracking a Chaos warband for weeks, a remnant of a larger force that had scattered after their primary fleet was destroyed. They had been assumed to be fleeing, demoralized, no longer a significant threat. The assumption was wrong. They had been maneuvering, positioning, waiting for the moment when our defenses were configured for pursuit rather than defense. They struck from the void, with weapons that should not have penetrated our shields, boarding craft that should not have reached our hull, warriors who should not have been able to breach the sacred corridors of a sisterhood vessel. But they did. They breached. And suddenly, the ship that had been sanctuary became a battleground. The corridors that I had walked in contemplation becoming kill zones where sisters and heretics slaughtered each other in close quarters, too confined for strategy or tactics. I fought without armor. My restoration had not yet occurred, and Repentia were not permitted the protection of sacred plate. I fought with my eviscerator, carving through chaos cultists and corrupted Astartes alike, my body moving with the automatic efficiency that 3.5 years of constant combat had burned into my muscles and nerves. I felt nothing as I killed. I felt nothing as my flesh was torn by weapons that should have ended me. I felt nothing except the cold purpose of a weapon being used for its intended function. The breach in the hull came without warning. One moment I was fighting in a corridor, my eviscerator buried in the chest of a cultist whose screaming prayers to dark gods had ended mid-syllable. The next moment the wall beside me tore open, the void beyond reaching in with fingers of absolute cold, pulling everything not secured toward the breach with the irresistible hunger of hard vacuum. Bodies tumbled past me, sisters and heretics alike, their conflict ended by an enemy that made no distinction between the faithful and the fallen. I grabbed hold of a structural beam, my fingers closing around metal that burned with cold, my body straining against the pull that sought to drag me into the nothing beyond the hull. Around me, others were less fortunate. I watched a sister I had fought beside for months disappear through the breach, her scream cut short as the void claimed her voice along with her breath. And then I saw the child. She was perhaps 10 years old, a servant or perhaps the daughter of a crew member, wearing the simple garments that marked those who served the ship's mundane functions. She had been caught in the corridor when the attack began, had hidden somewhere during the fighting, had emerged at precisely the wrong moment to be caught by the breach's pull. She was clinging to a pipe that ran along the ceiling, her small hands white-knuckled around metal that was slowly pulling free of its housing, her face a mask of terror as she stared at the void that waited to consume her. I could have let her fall. The mission did not require her survival. My restoration did not depend on her rescue. She was nothing, a single life among the millions that the Imperium spent each day without thought or hesitation, a child whose death would change nothing about the strategic situation or my own circumstances. I could have let her fall, and I would have felt nothing, because feeling nothing was what I had become. But I did not let her fall. I released my grip on the beam and threw myself toward her, my body fighting the pull of the void, my hands reaching for her small form, even as the breach dragged us both toward the nothing beyond. I caught her, wrapped my arms around her, twisted my body so that when we struck the edge of the breach, it was my back that took the impact rather than her fragile form. I felt ribs crack. I felt my skin tear against jagged metal. I felt the cold of the void reaching for us both with fingers that wanted to separate soul from flesh. And I held on. I do not know how long we hung there, suspended at the edge of annihilation, my broken body wedged against the breach while the child screamed into my chest, and the void howled its frustration at being denied its prey. Seconds, perhaps. Minutes. Long enough for emergency systems to engage, for void seals to slam into place, for the breach to be contained and the atmosphere to stabilize around us. When they pulled us from the wreckage, the child was still alive, still clutching my ruined body with hands that would not release their grip, still screaming, though the screams had become sobs, had become the wordless expression of terror that only children can produce when they have seen too much of what the universe truly contains. I was still alive too, barely. My body had sustained damage that should have been fatal. That would have been fatal if the medical servitors had not reached us when they did, if the chirurgeons had not worked through the night to piece together flesh that had been torn apart by vacuum and metal, and the simple violence of refusing to let a child die. Canoness Vrath visited me in the Medici Bay 3 days later, when I had recovered enough to receive visitors. She stood beside my bed for a long time, looking down at me with an expression I could not read through the haze of pain and medication that clouded my consciousness. "You saved the child," she said finally. "Yes, Canoness. You risked your life, threw away your life, for a servant's daughter who had no strategic value whatsoever." I did not respond. There was no response that would satisfy her. Mistress Morvenna told me you had been transformed, that you had become a weapon incapable of hesitation, incapable of the human weakness that led to your casting down. She told me you killed children on Varathos Quintus without pause, without feeling, without any of the sentiment that might have interfered with the mission. She leaned closer, her eyes searching my face for something I did not understand. "But you did not let this child die. You sacrificed yourself for her, knowing that your death would serve no purpose, knowing that she was nothing, knowing that the weapon you had become should not have been capable of such an act." I looked at her, and I felt something stir in the emptiness that had consumed me since that chamber on Varathos Quintus. Not a feeling, exactly. Not the fullness of emotion that I remembered from before my casting down, but something, a flicker, a spark, a fragment of whatever I had been before the sisterhood burned it away. "I do not know why I saved her," I said. "I did not think. I simply acted." The canoness straightened, and I saw something shift in her expression. Something that might have been disappointment, might have been recognition, might have been the particular weariness of a woman who had seen too many certainties crumble in her hands. "The ceremony of restoration is postponed," she said, "indefinitely. You are not the weapon we believed you had become. Something remains in you that should not remain. Some fragment of the weakness we thought had been excised." She turned toward the door, pausing at the threshold. "You will continue to serve as Repentia. You will continue to fight, to bleed, to seek the death that has thus far refused to claim you. And perhaps, in time, we will determine what you truly are. Weapon or woman, instrument or failure, something that can be used or something that must be discarded." She left. The door closed behind her, and I lay in the Medici Bay, my body broken, my restoration denied, my future uncertain. But for the first time in 3.5 years, I did not feel empty. I felt something. I did not know what it was. I did not know if it was weakness or strength, sin or salvation. The last remnant of humanity refusing to die, or something else entirely that had no name in the doctrines I had been taught. But I felt it, and feeling anything, even this nameless, formless thing, was more than I had believed I would ever feel again. 6 months have passed since I saved the child. I am still Repentia. I still wear the white shift that offers no protection, still carry the eviscerator that has become an extension of my ruined hands, still follow Mistress Morvenna into battles where my death would be acceptable and my survival is merely tolerated. The canoness has not summoned me again. The offer of restoration has not been renewed. I exist in a space that the sisterhood's doctrines do not quite accommodate. Neither the weapon they tried to forge, nor the woman I was before my casting down, but something else, something undefined, something that they do not know how to categorize or control. The child survived. Her name is Sarah. I learned this afterward, from the ship's records that I was not supposed to access, but that no one bothered to restrict from a Repentia, whose future had already been declared uncertain. She is 11 years old. Her mother serves in the ship's laundry facilities. Her father died in the same attack that nearly killed us both, crushed by debris in a corridor 3 decks below where Sarah and I hung suspended at the edge of the void. I have not spoken to her. I am not permitted to speak to her. Repentia do not converse with the ship's crew, do not form connections, do not engage in the human interactions that might remind them of what they were before their casting down. But I have seen her in the corridors, in the moments between battles when I am permitted to move through the ship's common areas, on my way to the chapel or the training facilities, or the cells where Repentia are stored between deployments. She sees me too. I know this because her eyes follow me when I pass, because her small face holds an expression that I cannot quite read, because once, just once, she raised her hand in a gesture that might have been a wave, might have been a blessing, might have been the simple acknowledgement of one soul recognizing another across the distances that doctrine has placed between us. I did not respond. I could not respond. But I felt something when I saw her hand rise. The same nameless thing I felt in the Medicae, the same spark that had flickered to life in the emptiness that Varathos Quintus had carved inside me. It is still there, that spark. It has not grown, has not become the fire of faith that I once carried in my heart. But it has not died either. It persists, small and fragile, refusing to be extinguished by the violence that surrounds me, and the emptiness that consumed me, and the doctrine that insists I should not be capable of feeling anything at all. I have thought much about what happened on that night, about why I saved her when everything I had become insisted I should have let her fall. I have prayed for understanding, have knelt in the chapel, and offered the words that once came so easily and now feel like stones in my mouth, have begged the emperor to explain why he would preserve this fragment of humanity in a vessel that was supposed to have been emptied of all such weakness. I have received no answer. Perhaps the emperor does not answer prayers from creatures like me. Perhaps he is waiting to see what I will do with this thing that remains inside me. Perhaps he has plans that do not require explanation, purposes that will only become clear when I reach whatever destination he has set for me, at the end of this road of blood and survival, and the small spark that refuses to die. Or perhaps there is no plan. Perhaps there is no purpose. Perhaps what happened was simply what happened. A moment of humanity breaking through the conditioning that should have destroyed it. A reflex too deeply embedded to be excised by 3.5 years of systematic brutalization. A reminder that the soul is not as easily shaped as the sisterhood believes. I do not know which possibility is true. I am not certain it matters. What matters is what I have learned about myself, about the sisterhood, about the nature of the transformation they call penance, and the weapon they tried to make of me. They were right, Mistress Morvenna and Canoness Vrath. The Repentia system is designed to destroy, not bodies, though bodies are destroyed aplenty, but the humanity that makes sisters capable of hesitation, of doubt, of seeing children as children, rather than obstacles to be removed. The process works. I have seen it work on dozens of my fellow Repentia, have watched them transform from broken women seeking redemption into empty vessels capable of any violence, have witnessed the light die in their eyes, as the endless repetition of slaughter strips away everything that made them who they were. It almost worked on me. On Varathos Quintus, it had worked. I killed those children without feeling anything, because there was nothing left inside me capable of feeling. The weapon had been forged. The woman had been destroyed. But something survived. Some fragment, some seed, some irreducible core of whatever I truly am that could not be reached by the process they had designed to destroy it. It hid in the depths of me, waiting, dormant, until the moment when a child clung to a pipe at the edge of the void, and something in me moved without thought, without calculation, without any of the cold functionality that should have been all that remained. I saved her because I could not do otherwise, not because of duty, not because of doctrine, not because of any calculation of strategic value or personal benefit. I saved her because somewhere inside me, beneath all the emptiness and the blood and the systematic destruction of everything I had been, there was still a woman who could not watch a child die without acting to prevent it. This is what they fear. This is why my restoration was revoked, why I am watched with suspicion, why the canoness spoke of determining what I truly am, as though the question were a threat rather than an inquiry. The sisterhood requires certainty. The sisterhood requires weapons that can be aimed and fired without concern for the human weaknesses that might cause them to miss, to hesitate, to fail at the crucial moment when failure cannot be tolerated. I am no longer certain. I can no longer be relied upon to kill without conscience, to obey without question, to be the instrument they tried to forge from my failure and my suffering, and my desperate desire for redemption. I am dangerous to them now, not because I might betray them, not because I might turn against the emperor I still serve, but because I have proven that their methods are not absolute, that their transformation can be survived, that the humanity they seek to destroy can persist in forms they do not expect and cannot control. I do not know what will happen to me. The sisterhood does not tolerate uncertainty, does not permit anomalies to persist when those anomalies might spread doubt among the faithful. They will make a decision eventually, restoration to some purpose they believe they can control, or final elimination of a variable that refuses to fit into their calculations. I will accept whatever judgment they deliver, because acceptance is all that remains to me, because I have no other path and no other purpose, and no other way to continue existing in a universe that has already taken everything, except this small spark that burns inside me. But I have learned something from these 3.5 years of blood and emptiness, and the moment when I threw myself into the void for a child I had never met. I was holy once. I believed that holiness meant absolute devotion, perfect obedience, the elimination of all human weakness in service of the Emperor's will. I believed that my hesitation on Carthus Majoris was sin, that the humanity which stayed my blade was a flaw to be corrected, that the sisterhood's judgment was righteous and their penance was justified. I no longer believe these things. I believe now that my hesitation was not weakness, but strength. The strength to see children as children, even when doctrine demanded I see them as obstacles. The strength to feel the weight of ending lives, even when orders required me to end them without thought. I believe that what the sisterhood calls sin is sometimes simply humanity, and that humanity is not always the enemy of faith, but sometimes its truest expression. I believe that the Emperor, if he watches, if he cares, if he is anything more than a corpse on a throne being fed the souls of thousands each day, would not want his daughters to become empty weapons, incapable of mercy, incapable of doubt, incapable of seeing the value in lives that doctrine deems valueless. I may be wrong. I have been wrong before. But I saved a child from the void, and she is alive because of what remains inside me. And I cannot bring myself to believe that this was sin. I cannot accept that the spark which moved me to act was weakness that should have been destroyed. I am Repentia. I am sin made flesh, failure given form, weakness walking upright and awaiting whatever judgment the sisterhood sees fit to deliver. But I am also still human, broken, scarred, emptied of so much that once gave my life meaning, but human nonetheless. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all that any of us can hope to remain in the end. Human, despite everything that the universe and our own institutions do to strip that humanity away from us. I was holy once. I am something else now. Something undefined. Something that does not fit the categories the sisterhood has created. Something that carries both the emptiness of the weapon they forged and the spark that refuses to be extinguished. I do not know what I am becoming. I do not know if what I am becoming has a place in the Imperium, in the sisterhood, in the war that consumes everything and everyone it touches. But I know that Sarah is alive. I know that I feel something when I see her in the corridors. I know that whatever remains inside me is not yet dead, not yet destroyed, not yet consumed by the emptiness that swallowed everything else. And until that spark goes out, until the last fragment of humanity is finally torn from me by violence or doctrine or the simple weight of continuing to exist in a universe that seems designed to crush such fragile things, I will carry it with me into battle, into blood, into whatever ending awaits me at the end of this road. I will carry it because it is all I have left, and because a child named Sarah is alive to see another day. And that truth is worth more than all the doctrine, all the penance, all the suffering that brought me to this place where I can finally understand what it means. I was holy once. I am human still. And perhaps, in the Emperor's eyes, those two things were never as different as the sisterhood taught me to believe.